Hey guys, so welcome to part 2 in my video series on where highlights go, or at least how I think about where to add highlights. So in the first lesson, we talked about how to determine, which sides are lit, which sides are not lit. We talked about the transition between the two. And in this lesson, we're going to talk about specular highlights or reflective highlights. And when you put those two together, I think you guys will find that it works pretty well. So let's just dive right in. All right, welcome everyone. My name is K. Michael Russell. I am a comic book colorist and I teach digital color here on YouTube. Now, most tutorials that I've seen on lighting don't tend to split this up quite like I have here, and it wasn't my idea. There's a book by Scott Robertson called How to Render, and it's where it was the first time that I had seen this described as doing it in two different steps, and it really resonated with me quite a bit and made things a lot simpler for me. So that's kind of how I want to describe this to you guys today. So to do a really quick recap on the first video, basically we talked about light sort of like a bouncing ball. As the light comes down on an object, the closer it is to this perpendicular surface, if the light's coming straight down, more of that light's going to bounce back, right? So the brightest part of the object is going to be at the top when we're talking about this type of lighting, this kind of diffuse passive lighting. And as the light gets along the edges and more of it starts bouncing away, it gets darker and darker until there's parts of the sphere here that don't get any light at all. We also talked a bit about transitions, going from, for example, the lightest part of an object here or a surface here to the darkest part. This transition that happens is going to be determined by how much space you have, and like in this case, it's a very soft round surface, so we've got pretty smooth transition. But in areas where that transition is very short, so like the brightest part of this wrinkle and the darkest part are really close to each other, so the transition is very small. You get a very hard edge. Now this cue ball here is an excellent example of this in the real world. It's kind of hard to see in this example, so I'm going to darken this up a little bit, add some contrast. So now you can see it a little bit better. So if we draw a line across the terminator here, which is just the transition between the light side and the dark side, if we were to find the point on this circle or on this ball that points directly at the light source, you can see the strong shadow out here to the right, it's going to be right about here, I would guess, as far as the point on the sphere that is directly perpendicular to the light source. Now one thing you'll notice is the specular highlight, or this reflective highlight, well, it's not there. Okay, it's in a different place. And that's the really important first distinction that I want you guys to make when you're determining where this sort of highlight goes. Because the location of this highlight is going to be determined not just by the light source, but where the camera is, okay, or where the viewer's eye is. Because we could walk around this table looking at this sphere, and I'm going to show you guys a video in a second, and this line's not going to move, okay? The light side's going to be the light side, the dark side's going to be the dark side, okay? But as we move around this table, this highlight is going to move with us. So I'll show you what I mean, and then I'll show you how to determine where that goes. Now, I don't have an actual cue ball and pool table to show this to you guys, so instead, we're going to use this bright spot on my forehead, okay? Because there's a light source about a 45-degree angle over here, and you can see it as I move my head, like you can see this little bright spot right here, right? Okay, now first I want you to notice this transition over here, okay? So we've got light turning to shadow over here. I've got a weak blue light over here. But if I move the camera, you're going to notice this transition really doesn't do much because the light is still on the light side. The shadow is still on the shadow side. So as I keep my head in the same spot, let's try right here, and move the camera, you can see that the shadow is still the shadow and the light is still the light. All that's in the same place. The diffuse light, the light that we talked about in the last video, all right, doesn't move, okay? But watch what happens with the specular highlight, okay? So again, keep my head in the same spot. I'm going to mark it with my finger. You can see it move as I press on it here. This is a weird video. Bear with me. So head in the same spot. Here's the bright part. Now as I move the camera back over here, look at what's happened. All right, the bright spot is now over here. Like we've moved from this corner all the way to the front, okay, right in the middle. And that's the difference between these light sources we're talking about. This light will move depending on where the camera position is, depending on where the reader's eye is, and that's going to factor in what we're talking about next, so keep that in mind. So to illustrate this a bit further, here's a very simplified version of my little setup here, and if it helps, think of this as the top of my head, okay? So nose would be here, ears here. Very Charlie Brown head, but you get the idea. But where that setup started was light over here. The camera is a little bit still on my right side, your left in the video, about right here. So the reason that specular highlight appears where it does is this bounce right here, okay? We've got our light source, it's hitting the object and it's bouncing right into the camera, and that's why that light is appearing there. Because if you think about even the word specular, I looked it up to find a definition for it because I'd always heard the term, but it means like a mirror, basically, or of or pertaining to a mirror or something like that. But anyway, if you think about this surface as being reflective like a mirror, that might help you kind of wrap your head around this a little bit. And this also explains why the specular highlight moves when the camera moves. Because if you look at this from the top like we are now, this angle and this angle are roughly the same. Because that's how a mirror works. You know, it reflects back in the exact same angle that it comes in. So if we were to move the camera over here, which is what I did, this angle has to change. This angle has to be equal to get to both sides of these. And if you'll remember that light appeared kind of right in the middle of my head, right about here. So this light is going to come over here, it's going to hit here, and then bounce over to the camera this way. Sorry, I'm not very good at drawing perfectly straight lines. This angle and this angle is the same again, because this reflection that we're talking about, this specular highlight, actually doesn't have much of a connection to the shadow or the main light that we covered in the last video. And that's why I think treating them as, at least thinking about them as two different kind of layers of rendering. Now, I don't mean like actually make a separate layer in Photoshop or whatever, but thinking of it as two layers on top of each other conceptually makes it a little bit easier. Now I know my angles aren't perfect here, but hopefully you guys get the idea. So looking back at this cue ball now that we know what we know, this should make more sense to you. So if we take this setup here, basically look straight down at it, something like this, then we've got the ball here, we've got our shadow being thrown out to the right, we've got the camera placed roughly where the camera is in the shot, and we've got our light source over here. So we just want to find the spot where this angle is the same on both sides. And that's roughly where this light is. Now some of you guys might be thinking, well, yeah, of course, if you draw it at the exact right angle and it goes right back to the camera and this is all equal, then yeah, it's going to be in the right place. But like, why did you draw this line here? You know, because we've got light hitting this from all angles. You know, how do we know which one of these rays gets us back to the camera? So for me personally, I think the easier way of kind of thinking this through is to think of it from the camera. If this was my scenario and I needed to shoot a photon of light or a bouncing ball or whatever you want to call it, if I wanted to bank a shot off of this item, off of this sphere, into the light, where would I need to make that shot? Okay, because if I shoot it down here, and again, thinking about these equal angles, it's just going to bounce back here, right? Talking about these two angles here. So that's not going to work. And if I go too far this way, it's going to bounce off here. So again, these angles are roughly equal. So where's that spot? Now, some people are going to be able to sort of intuit this out, you know. I mean, I'm drawing this angle on here just to make it easier for you guys, but it's going to be somewhere in here. And this is roughly the same angle. So it might help to think of it that way. You want to shoot your light from the camera into your light source. Where is that spot on whatever it is that you're coloring? And in this case, it's right here, which is why you see it here in the real world example. Is everybody with me? Hopefully. I know this is super technical stuff, but if you can wrap your head around this, it'll go a long way to making your rendering make a lot more sense. And before we move on to the next part of this, I want to do one more set of examples, actually using some of the illustrations from last time. So what we're seeing here on the left is we've got a sphere, we've got our light source right across from it to the right, and then here the light has been moved closer to us so you can see more of the lit surface, and in this example on the bottom, the light's further away. Okay, so we're seeing more of the shadow side. And over here, we basically have a top view of this same thing. So if this is, from our perspective, this is sort of an aerial view. And this is not exactly to scale, but I just wanted to get you guys thinking in the right direction. So in the first example, I've gone ahead and drawn the line from the camera in front of the sphere and bounced it over to our light source. Again, these angles are about the same, and that places our highlight right about here. And it makes sense if we move this light closer to us, so where it's closer to the camera, that the reflection would also move and become more in line with where the camera is. So you would get something kind of like this. So where this angle here is a little bit smaller, and this light has been shifted a little bit more toward the middle. Now, if we could somehow put the light directly in front of the camera like a flash, then of course it would be right there in the middle. And then in this last example, we've moved the light very far away. We've got a very, very obtuse angle through here. But again, these two areas being about equal. And we just get a little sliver, and it's actually kind of squashed too because of the perspective along that side there. So that hopefully should give you guys some indication of kind of how that light's going to move around a sphere. So I've talked about where this light goes and at least covered enough basics to give you guys kind of a ballpark idea of how this light works. Another thing to keep in mind though is the surface texture itself, and that the surface of whatever object is reflecting this light. Now, I've chosen these cue balls because they're very, very reflective, because the surface is very, very smooth. And so the smoother the surface is, the more mirror-like it's going to be, and the more reflections you're going to get. You know, if you look up, pictures of cue balls sitting on pool tables, I mean, you can see where every light in the room is placed basically, and even on the darker ones like this, then even the color temperature, you can see. So you're coloring with the color of your light on these kind of highlights most of the time, I would say. Or as a general rule, that's probably a pretty good idea. I hesitate to say always, but yeah, location's one thing, but the surface texture is another. So what if it doesn't have a smooth texture like this? What if it's something more like a basketball? Well, a basketball is much rougher, okay? And if you're not familiar with, a basketball, it's covered in a very rough material to give the player something to grip onto. But then there are these black stripes, which are generally smoother. And you can actually see kind of both of these side by side here. We've got this very diffuse kind of reflected light on the top of the ball, but then in these black grooves where the texture is smoother, you can see it's a much smaller, more mirror-like transition, or more mirror-like reflected light, because that area is smooth. These little black strips are very smooth. So not quite as smooth as the cue ball we're looking at, but they're still smooth. So you can see the highlight's very small and pretty well defined. But the rougher the surface is of the texture you're looking at, these specular highlights will get really diffuse and get really spread out. It won't be these tight little small highlights like you're seeing here. So something else to keep in mind, I found another good shot of this here. You can see all these bright lights above it, but they're still not defined. We're getting kind of general areas of where these lights are coming from, and we can see they're coming from the top, but you're not going to get those mirror-like reflections, obviously, unless the surface is smooth enough to allow for that. And so this type of light is more what you're going to see on things like leather and even skin to a lesser degree, and fabrics and things. You're not going to get mirror-like specular highlights on these, but you're still going to get some reflected light. All right, so going back to the exercise we used last time, this was drawn by Max Dunbar specifically for this lesson, so thanks, Max. So let's put some of this together. So let's say this guy is lit in a very similar way that this light in front of my head over here is. And I'm not going to dictate you guys, to color a certain way, or to use a certain brushing technique, or to use a lasso, or like this applies however you want to actually do your rendering. So this is definitely not the only way to do this. But I'm going to get a big soft gradient over his head, so I'm going to select most of that. But then under here, this one's not going to be, it's going to be more of a harder edge. And we'll just do his head for now. Let's erase or remove the selections from inside his ear. And like his nose would be lit here. Something like this. And I'll just use a screen. This is a big soft brush, nothing fancy. It's in screen mode. And we'll do something like this. We can make it a little bit brighter there, kind of on this, again, thinking about that like 45-degree angle along kind of here in his head, right? This would basically be what we discussed in the last lesson, just the light reaching the surface, and that's basically it. Part of it's lit, part of it's not lit. Now, as far as for this lesson, the specular highlights are going to run kind of through here. So I just make this brush a little bit smaller, maybe a little bit harder. Catch the forehead there. I'm not being super careful with these selections, but the nose, maybe the cheek here. And keep in mind that these little specular highlights don't necessarily have to be small. I mean, sometimes it might catch like this entire surface, like this is all kind of one flat plane and almost. So that whole area might like equally reflect the light source if it happens to catch it at the right angles. That's something else to keep in mind. It's not always going to be, a soft little spot. But thinking about it this way, and I'm just adding in some brighter lights like on his nose, all of these little areas that are facing that angle, that roughly 45-degree angle there. Now on areas that are cylinders, a lot of times these specular highlights will get stretched sort of into lines. So like if I were to select like this arm to color it, then I might put a soft highlight, and then the reflected light, depending on the material, skin's not always quite this reflective unless it's wet. If the skin's wet, you'll get a lot of really strong reflective highlights. So keep in mind that specular shape can be almost any shape. It just depends on what level what the surface texture is and the kind of plane that you're working with, and that's something that's just going to have to come with practice. But now that you guys have kind of seen these two types of lighting and passive and reflected light, this is something you can start practicing. This is something you can start looking for. Like I said in the last video, just in the movies you watch. I noticed this, for example, in the episode of True Detective. Let me pull it up real quick. Okay, so this is a scene from True Detective. This is Mahershala Ali's character, and he's being lit by this window over here, primarily. There's also some lights coming from this room over here behind him. But I want you guys to notice a couple things here. So first, I want you to watch this spot right here, okay? Because right now it's pretty visible, right? So it's pretty obvious that we've got a light source here. Now, as the camera shifts right from here to here, look at how much dimmer that light appears to be. It's almost like that side of his face isn't lit at all. Now, we can't see very much of it, but you can see that it's darker comparing that to this. Now, the reason for that is when you look at this room back here, all of these lights back here, it's at just the right angle that we're basically catching a reflected light in that plane on the side of his head, because there's no light source over here pointing directly at this area. This is just the reflection of the light coming from this room. So as we switch the angle, you can still see just a little bit of that there, but it's nowhere near as bright because that angle is no longer pointing right back into the camera. That reflection's happening over here to the right somewhere is where it's strongest. So as the camera shifts, that light doesn't become as bright anymore. And I had mentioned earlier about how the shapes of these reflective highlights, can change and morph, of course, as the object moves and changes. So if you look at the shape of light that's on his face now, watch what happens as he turns to the right. You see how now this side is that plane, that big flat plane on that side of his head. It's pretty much reflecting the entire window now. And as we go back to where it was, you can see it's being broken up now, of course, by his eyes and nose and everything else. But I thought this gave a really good indication of just how reflective that skin can be. And as I was skimming through this video looking for other examples, in this one, you can see just how strong of a reflection this is, because it's actually even picking up the green from the trees, on the side of his face here, because at this angle, against a very obtuse, very open angle going from our camera off the side of his head into that green area behind there. So it's a really good example of that, reflected light on the side of his face. So I apologize for the sound quality on this part. I'm sure it's not great, but I just wanted to tell you guys to start looking for this stuff in the real world, like this reflective cup thing that we have. And you can see, like, as I move toward the light source, how it's getting closer and closer and stretching along that edge and getting those reflections like that. And as we turn the other direction, you can see it's getting more. We can even see my reflection in this thing. But yeah, just look at how reflections move on surfaces as they move around. I was noticing on this guitar how it's pretty much a mirror in the front, but all the highlights kind of gather along that edge because the angle's changing, if I were to try to shoot a beam from where I am right now to that light, I would have to be along this edge right here. And it moves with me as I move, and that changes. So yeah, it's a strange little weird thing you guys can start looking for. So I hope this video has given you guys something to think about, and hopefully you've learned something. And when you're studying this on your own, and whether you're looking at real life or you're looking at movies and TV, like movies and TV shows are great because they're often dramatically lit, which is what we like in comics too. So if your focus is color for comics, especially, that's a great place to really start looking for some of this stuff. And for me, it wasn't until after I realized what I was looking at that I really started learning and feeling like I was starting to wrap my head around some of these concepts. And this video doesn't have all the answers. Like, there's, for every scenario I brought up, there's 100 that I didn't, and I tried to be as broad as I could and get you guys thinking in the right direction. But the heavy lifting, the main legwork of getting better at this is just putting in the work, putting in the time, coloring as much as you can, observing as much as you can, and hopefully I've given you guys something to go on here. And if you want to learn more, be sure to check the links in the description. I've got coloring courses on color for comics and using Procreate and different things. I have several free resources down there. There's a beginner's lesson. There's my top 10, top 20, what is it? My PDF on, I can't remember how many tips it is, but like my coloring tips PDF guide thing is down there. And of course, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more of this stuff. There's a Patreon down there, PSD files. Yeah, so check all the things. Oh yeah, and part 3 of this series is going to be on what to do in the shadows. This is something that I get asked about a lot in a roundabout way, in many different ways, but especially if you have a character that's, backlit and most of their features are in shadow, what do you do in the shadows, right? Well, that's part 3 of this video, or this series. So look forward to that. And as always, thank you so much for watching. I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.